In the 1980s, this plant was assembling missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads across continents. In the 1990s, it was building city trolleybuses, and the main task was simply to find buyers in order to pay workers their salaries. This is not irony. It is the direct consequence of the collapse of an entire system. Today, this is a story of how a Ukrainian defense giant tried to survive in the 1990s, and how good the trolleybuses it produced actually were. After all, in public perception, there's a long-standing belief that anything manufactured by defense plants was inherently of higher quality than civilian products. The Yuzhmash plant did not become a defense enterprise right away. In 1944, construction began in Dnipropetrovsk on a new automotive factory that was supposed to produce trucks and tractors for post-war reconstruction. The first planned model was the DAZ 150 Ukrainets, a modernized version of the Moscow-built ZIS 150. The main difference was the cab. Local engineers significantly redesigned it, making the original ZIS design difficult to recognize. The truck passed state testing, was approved for mass production, and even entered limited initial production. But soon, the plans changed abruptly. Production was halted, and the factory unexpectedly changed its purpose. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union entered the nuclear arms race, and the Dnipropetrovsk plant found itself at its center. Instead of trucks and tractors, it was assigned to produce missile systems. To support this shift, a separate design bureau was created, workshops were rebuilt, and the entire production structure was reorganized. From that point until the late 1980s, Yuzhmash became an enterprise of exceptional strategic importance. Funding was provided with few limitations, and top specialists were recruited from across the country. The plant's main specialization became intercontinental ballistic missiles, including silo-based and mobile systems for nuclear deterrence. Its most important product was the R-36 missile, known in the West as Satan. This designation was not accidental. By its technical characteristics, it was one of the most powerful and dangerous missiles in the world. Despite its strategic importance, Yuzhmash, like hundreds of other defense enterprises, was required to produce civilian goods alongside its military output. In 1966, the plant began manufacturing tractors. Today, this practice may seem unusual, but within the framework of a planned economy, it followed a clear logic. Military factories were vast in both size and workforce, yet they were not always fully occupied with defense orders. Missiles and tanks were not mass-market products. Therefore, while in market economies, civilian production is driven by profit, in the Soviet system it was intended to keep factories operating and to preserve jobs. Propaganda also played a role. The public was told that defense enterprises did not merely consume national resources, but also produced useful goods for ordinary citizens. There was also a practical reason. Yuzhmash received priority funding and access to top engineering talent, which made it easier to add tractor production to an existing facility than to build a new factory from scratch. Finally, there was the factor of secrecy. Maintaining civilian production helped conceal the military nature of the plant and, in the event of conflict, allowed it to be presented to the outside world as a peaceful factory rather than a missile facility. Until the late 1980s, Yuzhmash remained financially stable. In addition to missile production, the plant was also involved in space projects. However, by the end of the decade, the Soviet economy began to collapse, and serious problems became unavoidable. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the plant entered a deep crisis. Military orders stopped completely. Unlike armored vehicle factories, which at least received contracts for equipment repairs, Yuzhmash was left with almost no funding. Independent Ukraine was itself in severe economic difficulty. The country had neither the resources nor the priorities for space programs or intercontinental missiles. In addition, it adopted a policy of nuclear disarmament. Hundreds of engineers who had recently belonged to the country's technical elite lost their jobs. They were followed by thousands of other specialists and workers. Formerly, the plant still had one potential lifeline: tractor production. But this opportunity did not become a real solution. During the years of relative prosperity, civilian production had been treated as secondary. It received little investment, modernization, or development, and functioned largely on a residual basis. As a result, By the 1990s, UMZ tractors were no longer competitive. In practice, they were simplified counterparts to products from the Minsk Tractor Works, where agricultural machinery had always been the main focus. MTZ continued to develop actively and entered the market economy in much stronger condition. Yes, Yuzhmash products had a reputation for defense-grade quality, which at the time meant durability and reliability. But in real market competition, this was not enough. The plant ultimately lost the market to its Minsk competitors. It was at this point in the story that trolleybuses entered the picture. In the early 1990s, Ukrainian cities relied mainly on aging vehicles, Czech Škoda, Romanian DAC, and Soviet ZU models. These trolleybuses had formed the backbone of urban fleets since Soviet times, but by then they were already heavily worn. All of the factories that had produced them were now located outside the country. Articulated vehicles were in particularly poor condition. Their service life was nearly exhausted, maintenance costs were rising, and there were no funds available to replace them. In Kiev and Kharkiv, another problem became apparent. Single-motor articulated models such as the ZU 683 and DAC 217E struggled on routes with steep inclines, while city budgets could not afford the purchase of modern Czech Škoda 15TR vehicles. In practical terms, the cities had reached a dead end. It was under these circumstances in 1991 that specialists at the Kiev Electric Transport Plant decided to resume the production of passenger trolleybuses. For nearly 20 years prior to that, the enterprise had produced only service and cargo vehicles. This led to the creation of the Kiev 11 trolleybus, the first serial trolleybus of independent Ukraine. These were large, articulated vehicles equipped with 2 traction motors and designed for demanding operating conditions, including full passenger loads, poor road surfaces, long inclines, and harsh weather. The first Kiev 11 trolleybuses left the assembly line in late 1991. However, due to a lack of funding, only 6 vehicles were built during the first 2 years. 3 were sent to Kiev and 3 to Bila Tserkva. Feedback from operators was disappointing. The trolleybus was clearly unfinished, with low reliability and poor build quality. As a result, factory management abandoned plans for mass production of the articulated version and decided to focus on a shorter model instead. Between 1992 and 1995, small batches of these vehicles were produced, but they suffered from the same problems: weak build quality and frequent breakdowns. It soon became clear that the Kiev Electric Transport Plant was unable to cope with the task. This was evident relatively quickly. As early as 1992, within the framework of government programs, Yuzhmash was tasked with refining the design, improving reliability, and organizing production based on the Kiev 11 platform. In Dnipropetrovsk, the work was approached with enthusiasm. Dozens of changes were introduced. Traction motors and compressors were replaced with maintenance-free units. Compact cable connectors used in missile technology were implemented, and the motor generator was replaced with a static voltage converter. At that time, Yuzhmash was headed by Leonid Kuchma, who would later become president of Ukraine. As a result, the new trolleybuses received the ironic nickname Kuchmovoz, literally Kuchma bus, referring to the plant's director. In January 1992, the first UMZT-1 vehicles left the factory gates. Unlike the Kiev-built models, they were received very positively. Reliability and build quality were significantly higher, power output was greater, and maintenance was easier. Major components were moved to the roof and made easily accessible to mechanics. There were, however, some drawbacks. Operators noted increased electricity consumption and less than ideal performance of the passenger compartment heating system. By the end of 1992, more than 20 vehicles had been produced. For the crisis conditions of a newly independent state, this was a respectable result. Thanks to its 2 traction motors and driven axles, the UMZT-1 operated reliably in difficult conditions and could climb gradients of up to 12% without losing speed. Among drivers, working on these trolleybuses was considered prestigious, and operating conditions were noticeably better than on ZU vehicles. In 1993, the model underwent modernization. The glazing area was significantly increased, The interior layout was revised, and the lighting system was updated. In the same year, production of the shorter version, the UMZ T2, began. Despite their strengths, Dnipropetrovsk-built trolleybuses never became truly widespread. The reason was simple: a lack of money on the customer's side, meaning the state. Even after the transition to a market economy, urban transport systems remained largely government-controlled, and their budgets were extremely limited. In addition, Yuzhmash trolleybuses were noticeably more expensive than Russian-built ZU models. The latter were cheaper, more familiar to local mechanics, and supported by an established maintenance infrastructure. As a result, despite frequent talk about supporting domestic manufacturers, many cities continued to purchase Russian vehicles. As market-based pricing was gradually introduced, another problem became apparent: the high energy consumption of UMZ trolleybuses. Once electricity began to be paid for at real market rates, operating these vehicles became increasingly unprofitable. As a result, production of the articulated model ended in 1996, while the shorter version remained in production much longer, until 2008. A low-floor model intended to replace aging fleets failed to attract significant interest, and mass production never began. In 2016, the plant started assembling MAZ trolleybuses under its own Dnipro brand. However, it was difficult to describe this as full-scale manufacturing. The bodies arrived from Belarus almost fully completed, and only final assembly was carried out in Dnipro. This did not become a solution either. While the factory lacked a new competitive model, the market was occupied by other manufacturers, both domestic and foreign. As a result, Dnipropetrovsk-built trolleybuses were left with only a small share of an already limited market. The situation with the plant's core military production did not improve. On the contrary, over time it continued to deteriorate. In the 1990s, Yuzhmash managed to survive largely thanks to its space program, primarily the Zenit launch vehicle and the Sea Launch project. These programs allowed the enterprise to retain part of its orders and technical personnel. However, in the early 2000s, a new decline began. The Sea Launch program was suspended, launch volumes decreased, and dependence on Russia, which at the time was both a partner and a competitor, became a serious problem. At the same time, the main difficulty was not only political. Yuzhmash was a product of the Soviet defense system. This vast industrial complex had been built to serve a superpower and was integrated into its military doctrine. In the 1990s, a superpower's factory was left without the superpower itself. In that sense, the plant's survival can almost be considered a minor miracle. Despite repeated crises, interruptions, and a sharp reduction in scale, the enterprise continued to operate. By the beginning of the war in 2022, Yuzhmash was already functioning at the edge of viability. It was producing only small batches of trolleybuses and fulfilling occasional isolated contracts. During the hostilities, the plant was targeted multiple times. The exact extent of the damage has not been disclosed and remains classified. However, it is clear that the enterprise is unlikely to be restored in its previous form. Even so, hope remains. The history of Yuzhmash shows that the plant has already endured periods when its future seemed uncertain. And it is possible that one day, new trolleybuses may once again appear in its workshop.